Hi everyone, I'm here to provide some perspective from the human behavioral ecology literature on the relationship between resource limitation and sociality. And I'll do that by highlighting a few recent papers in the Human Ecology Group, which is led by Adrian Yagi at the University of Zurich, um, as well as a paper by my co-author, Jordan Martin. And first I wanted to motivate humans as a model organism for studying behavioral variation and behavioral plasticity. So it should come as no surprise to learn that humans live in a staggering range of environments. We occupy every single biome on Earth, and more recently outer space. Our ability to live in all these really varied environments is made possible not by genetic variation, but instead by behavioral variance, such as our subsistence practices, technology, variable family structure and social organization, as well as institutions that manage cooperation and conflict among and between human societies. You might call this variation culture, except that nobody agrees on what that word means. So in this talk, I really want to highlight how the comparative study of human behavior can be used to understand the link between resource limitation and the evolution of sociality. Particularly, I want to focus on food sharing and alloparenting, where alloparenting is a form of cooperative breeding. So these topics are notable not just because that they're really variable across human societies, but also because they're really relevant to the broader evolutionary ecology literature. So launching first into food sharing, I wanted to put the human pattern of exchange and sharing into phylogenetic context. So many other primates do exhibit food sharing, but this tends to be restricted to parents sharing with offspring, and in a few species, sharing among adults only when there's opportunity for partner selection in the domain of, let's say, mating or coalitionary formation. We see food sharing in those species. So in no way is food sharing a behavior that's unique to humans, nor even primates, but humans stand out in the scope and frequency of their sharing. So food sharing between non-relatives and even strangers is common and occurs on a daily basis among many hunter-gatherer societies. So the origins of this difference have been linked in the literature to the types of food resources that humans exploit, which are higher quality or more nutrient dense than other primates, but also more challenging to produce and more prone to unpredictable shortfalls. In other words, human foraging is risky and qualitatively different than the types of foods that other primates exploit. So building on that idea, something to keep in mind is that human societies are characterized by very high interdependence among producers. And part of this is due to the steep learning curves for our subsistence strategies. So in many foraging and horticultural societies, individuals don't actually become net producers, by which I mean producing more calories than they consume every day, until late adolescence or even early adulthood. So that's what you see in the figure on the lower left, is it's contrasting production and consumption terms over the life course among Chimane, who are a lowland horticultural society in Bolivia. And so this pattern is not specific to Chimane, it's quite common among foraging societies. And what it does is it basically creates the need for food sharing within families because the kids are taking a long time before they can feed themselves. And in contrast, food sharing between families, so between households, is often necessary because of the aforementioned unpredictability of human foraging. So on the right, what we're looking at are data from hunting returns among the Ache of Paraguay, our hunter-gatherer society. And what you're seeing in this figure is that on any given day, the probability that a hunter will bring nothing home, a zero return, is very high, even for adults at peak productivity. However, when a forager is successful, they're often producing more than they and their immediate family could plausibly consume before it went to waste. So think about how much meat there is on a large animal for some intuition. And so what this does is it creates the opportunity for a system of risk buffering where periodic shortfalls, zero returns, are compensated by overproduction and sharing of that surplus. And while the system that I've just described seems to fit pretty well with many hunter-gatherer and other foraging populations, there's really a tremendous amount of cross-cultural variation in how often and with whom food is shared. So this study that I worked on some years back found that while some degree of food sharing between households is a cross-cultural universal, so it's present in all societies that we looked at, the scope and frequency of that sharing is hypervariable, and that deserves some explanation. Why is there this behavioral variability? So before I move on and try to explain why we think some of that variability exists, I'm going to take a methodological aside to briefly describe where these data come from, as it's going to be really important to keep in mind for the studies I'm going to discuss today. So I'm talking about data from non-industrial societies, so small-scale human societies. And most data from these societies comes from anthropologists. And the traditional method in anthropology is long-term field work, where you go and live in another community for an extended period of time. Often anthropologists spend years of their lives there, learning the language and getting to know folks and trying to gain some insights into another culture via some combination of qualitative and quantitative approaches. Okay, that's the basic setup. And it's less book focused these days, but for most of our discipline's history, anthropologists would try to synthesize their findings from their fieldwork into ethnographies, which are usually published as a book. And the cross-cultural comparative approach in anthropology recognized that the accumulation of this data, of all these ethnographies from anthropologists going and studying peoples of the world, could really be synthesized and used to both assess variability cross-culturally and test hypotheses to try to explain variation in human behavior and culture. So the comparative project is really facilitated by a particular institution called the Human Relations Area Files, or HRAF. And what HRAF does is they take these ethnographies and then trained analysts break them down paragraph by paragraph and give them subject codes. So in a given paragraph, they say all the relevant subjects that the ethnographer was writing about. And what this means is if you wanted a representative sample of the cross-cultural record of, let's say, food sharing practices, you could efficiently collate that text. You could get the entire ethnographic universe of anthropologists talking about food sharing all over the world. So from that point, what we do is we code these ethnographic records qualitatively and usually iteratively to get a sense of the cross-cultural variation in behaviors like food sharing. And then once we've assembled these codes, try to test hypotheses to try to explain that variation. And it's worth noting here that a general limitation of this approach is that while you can make broad generalizations about a society, sort of stereotype features, you're pretty much always losing individual variation in behavior. So looping back around to this study, what we did is we coded written reports of food sharing practices in 98 non-industrial societies from around the world. And we had hypothesized that there would be more food sharing between households in societies that experience more resource stress, measured as food-destroying natural hazards, famine, and chronic food scarcity. Hypothesized this because of the general expectation in evolutionary ecology of enhanced cooperation in the face of shared ecological challenges. And what we found, using very stylized figures here, you can go to the paper for the full report, was that intermittent or seasonal levels of sharing were positively associated with resource stress. So more resource stress or limitation, more sharing But daily food sharing, that is, sharing between households on a daily basis, as is common among hunter-gatherers, as we discussed before, was basically uncorrelated with the degree of resource stress. So the timescale matters in this study. And this result was really puzzling to us, but I reasoned that maybe the reason why there wasn't an association between daily sharing is because the types of stressors, the types of resource stress that we were measuring were on the wrong time scale. Intermittent disasters or famine would not necessarily lead to this type of everyday interdependence in production. So what I did was lead a follow-up study to take a closer look at what sorts of socio-ecological variables were associated with daily food sharing, which remember is theorized to have been particularly important as a risk buffering mechanism for most of our species' evolutionary history when humans relied entirely on foraging. I also want to take an aside to mention that much like cross-species comparative studies, cross-cultural studies can be plagued by the statistical non-independence of data points. So societies that are closely related to each other may share behaviors not because of response to resource stress, but rather because of some common cultural inheritance or set of third variables. So in our lab, we've taken a leading role in addressing this problem via phylogenetic multi-level models. And I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of those techniques here, but I thought it was worth a mention. Okay, so in this follow-up study, what we found was that daily food sharing between households is less likely in societies that have alternative ways of buffering risk or making their subsistence more self-reliant. So specifically, societies with food storage technologies, which allow you to save your surplus, we're less likely to have daily food sharing. Societies that had more dependence on animal husbandry, so they kept livestock, were less likely to have everyday food sharing. So to pump your intuition on that one, think about the word livestock, right? You're literally embodying your surplus in the animal. And the nature of livestock is not that it has no risk, but the risks it has don't vary on a day-to-day basis in the way that foraging does, okay? And additionally, you found that external trade, so basically market integration, was associated with lower levels of daily sharing, presumably because surplus can be sold to the market and shortfalls in production can be compensated through exchange rather than from sharing with your neighbors. So the last study I wanted to highlight today is about alloparenting. And recall that we talked about how human life histories are characterized by this extended period of juvenile dependency. And what's more unusual is that we couple this with shorter interbirth intervals and greater total fertility than other great apes. And this begs the question, who's paying for all these expensive kids? So the short answer is it depends. It's pretty variable. But it's very rarely the case that all of this burden falls upon the mother or even within the nuclear family. So alloparenting, which is where other individuals besides the mother and father care and invest in children, is widespread across human societies. But in keeping with our theme, there's tremendous variability in the intensity of alloparenting, and that behavioral variation is linked to variation in resource availability and predictability. So in this study, led by Jordan Martin, we once again drew on ethnographic records from 133 societies around the world. And we were looking at the association between environmental harshness, which we operationalized using principal components analysis on a variety of climatic measures, as well as measures of starvation risk in these societies. And what we found was that the probability of intensive or high alloparental care is greatest in environments that are characterized by not only reduced climate predictability, but also relatively low average temperatures and low amounts of precipitation. So this is one way of thinking about harshness in the environment. So at the same time, the probability of high alloparenting is always low in societies that are under strong starvation risk, suggesting basically that cooperation is attenuated in harsh environments where the direct benefits of cooperation become too high. And these results are quite consistent with previous comparative work observed in both birds and mammals, which I think highlights some nice convergence in the social evolutionary processes. All right, I'm going to wrap up now, but thank you very much for listening, and I hope that my overview of these 3 studies has sparked a little bit of interest in the potential for intra-specific comparative studies with humans. Thank you.